There are places in this world where truth becomes a physical thing, where lies carry weight and fire, where the boundary between what is spoken and what is real grows thin as parchment held against a flame. Montana Territory in 1860 was such a place. It was a land of infinite sky and bitter wind, where men came to disappear into mountains that had no names on any map, where fortunes were promised in the color of a stream, and where death waited in the silence between heartbeats. This is a story about a trading post that stood at the edge of nowhere, about lanterns that burned without oil, and about the terrible price of deception in a place where even the earth itself seemed to be listening. The winter of 1860 arrived early in the Montana Territory, sweeping down from the Canadian wastes with a fury that caught even the native peoples by surprise. By October, snow had already buried the high passes, and the few scattered settlements that clung to existence along the Territorial rivers found themselves isolated from the world beyond. It was in this season of enforced solitude that our story takes root in a place called Clement Station. Though whether it was named for the man who built it or for some quality he hoped to find there, no record remains to tell us. Clement Station was not a town, not properly speaking. It was a trading post, a way station, a collection of log structures huddled together on the western bank of the Yellowstone River, where the water ran black and swift between walls of stone. The main building was a long, low structure, with a sod roof and windows made of oiled paper that glowed amber in the firelight. There was a stable, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug deep into the frozen earth, and a bunkhouse where travelers could sleep for 2 bits a night if they didn't mind the fleas, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed close together against the cold. The man who kept the station was named Jeremiah Clement, a former trapper who had lost 3 toes to frostbite and all his teeth to scurvy before he was 30. He was a silent man, given to long periods of contemplation broken only by the scratch of his pencil in his ledger book, where he recorded every transaction in a hand so precise it might have belonged to a Boston clerk. His wife, Elizabeth, was a thin woman with gray eyes and hands that were never still, always mending, always stirring, always working. They had come to the territory 5 years earlier with dreams of prosperity, and had found instead only the grinding endurance that passes for success in such places. In that October of 1860, as the first serious snows began to fall, a party of miners arrived at Clement Station. There were 7 of them, gaunt men with hollow eyes and the peculiar desperation of those who have spent months in the mountains with nothing to show for it but calluses and disappointment. They carried their worldly possessions on their backs and in a single mule-drawn wagon whose wheels screamed for grease with every revolution. Their leader, if such a word could be applied to the man who spoke most and loudest, was called Nathaniel Cord. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a black beard that grew wild across his chest, and a voice that seemed too large for any indoor space. Cord negotiated shelter for his party with Jeremiah Clement, and they agreed on terms. The miners would stay in the bunkhouse. They would take their meals at the common table. They would pay in dust or in coin, and they would cause no trouble. These were standard arrangements, made 100 times before at 100 different stations across the territory. There was no reason to think this would be any different. The first night passed without incident. The miners ate their beans and saubali in silence, grateful for hot food after weeks of cold camps and hunger. They slept heavily, exhausted by their journey. Jeremiah Clement sat by his fire and worked his ledger, recording the transaction. Elizabeth mended a shirt that had more patches than original fabric. The wind howled outside, throwing snow against the walls in gusts that sounded like the breath of some immense creature circling the station in the darkness. It was on the second night that the strangeness began. The evening meal had been served and consumed. The miners sat around the fire in the main room, passing a bottle of whiskey that one of them had produced from somewhere. They talked, as men will talk when isolated from civilization, about women and wealth, about schemes and dreams, about the rich strikes they had heard of and the fortunes that surely awaited them if only they could find the right creek, the right hillside, the right turn of luck. Jeremiah Clement sat apart from them, working on a broken harness with an awl and a length of rawhide. Elizabeth had retired to the small room behind the counter where she and Jeremiah slept. The trading post was lit by 4 lanterns. 3 hung from hooks screwed into the ceiling beams, spaced evenly along the length of the room. The 4th sat on the counter, illuminating the space where Jeremiah worked. They were simple things, tin and glass, burning cheap kerosene that smelled of sulfur and left a film of soot on everything. The light they gave was yellow and inconstant, making shadows jump and dance on the log walls. One of the miners, a young man named Thomas Pike, was telling a story about a claim he had worked in California 3 years earlier. He said he had pulled $2,000 worth of color from a single sluice box in a single week. He said it with the casual confidence of a man describing something mundane, but there was something in his eyes that contradicted his words, a desperate hunger that made his story feel hollow even as it left his lips. As he spoke, one of the lanterns, the one hanging nearest to where he sat, began to burn brighter. It happened slowly at first, so gradually that no one noticed. The flame grew taller, hotter, until the glass chimney glowed with an intensity that was almost painful to look at directly. Then Thomas Pike finished his story, and the lantern returned to its normal state, as if someone had turned down a wick that no hand had touched. Jeremiah Clement saw it. He was facing that direction, and his eyes, accustomed to noticing small details, registered the change. He said nothing. In the Montana Territory, a man learned to be cautious about what he pointed out, what he questioned, what he allowed himself to acknowledge. Strange things happened in the mountains. Lights were seen where no lights should be. Sounds carried on the wind that had no earthly source. It was better to observe and remain silent than to speak and invite attention from whatever forces moved in the darkness beyond the firelight. But the lanterns were not finished. Throughout that evening, as the miners talked and drank and gradually grew louder, the lanterns responded. When Nathaniel Cord spoke of a rich claim he said he had sold for a profit before coming north, the lantern above his head flared bright as noon. When another man, whose name was Samuel Brent, described the faithfulness of a wife he had left behind in Ohio, the lantern nearest him burned so hot that everyone in the room could feel the heat radiating from it. Each time a man spoke something that was not entirely true, the lanterns blazed. Each time a statement of pure fact was uttered, they remained steady and calm. By the end of the evening, Jeremiah Clement was certain of what he was seeing, though he could not begin to explain it. The lanterns were responding to lies, not to opinions or exaggerations or the harmless boasts that men make in their cups, but to deliberate untruths, to statements spoken with the intention to deceive. It was as if the flames themselves could hear, could judge, could make visible the invisible corruption of false words. He told Elizabeth that night, after the miners had stumbled off to the bunkhouse and the main room was dark, except for a single candle. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her face still and thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that they should tell no one, that they should watch and wait, that whatever this was, it was not their place to interfere with it. Jeremiah agreed. They blew out the candle and lay awake in the darkness, listening to the wind and to the sounds of the buildings settling around them, and neither spoke of the fear that had taken root in both their hearts. The next day dawned gray and cold. The miners rose late, nursing headaches and sour stomachs. They ate breakfast in near silence, then announced their intention to spend another few days at the station before attempting the journey back to Fort Benton. The weather, they said, was too uncertain for travel. Better to wait for a clear spell than to die frozen in a snowbank for the sake of impatience. Jeremiah agreed to extend their stay and adjusted his ledger accordingly. Money changed hands. Life at Clement's station continued in its usual patterns. But that evening, when the miners gathered again in the main room, the lanterns were waiting. The flames burned steady as the men first assembled, innocent and ordinary. Then, the conversation began. Someone made a joke. Someone else told a story. And the lanterns began their strange dance once more, flaring and dimming, responding to words as if words had weight and substance and could be measured by fire. This time, the miners noticed. It was impossible not to. Thomas Pike was in the middle of describing a fight he claimed to have won in a Sacramento saloon when the lantern above him suddenly burned with such intensity that he stopped mid-sentence, staring upward with his mouth hanging open. The flame was white-hot, so bright it cast shadows in directions that seemed geometrically impossible. Then, just as suddenly, it returned to normal, leaving purple after-images floating in everyone's vision. There was a moment of profound silence. Then Samuel Brent laughed, a nervous sound that cracked in the middle. He said it must be bad kerosene, some chemical impurity causing the flame to surge. Nathaniel Cord agreed, his voice too loud, too insistent. Yes, bad fuel. Nothing more. Just a bad batch of kerosene. Anyone could see that. It meant nothing. But as Cord spoke those words, declaring the strangeness to be nothing, the lantern directly above his head flared so violently that the glass chimney cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. The flame shot upward, nearly touching the ceiling beam, and for a brief moment everyone in the room could feel the heat of it on their faces. Then it subsided, settling back into its normal burning, and the cracked chimney continued to hold, though a thin line of fracture ran from top to bottom like a wound in glass. No one laughed after that. The miners exchanged glances, uncertain and afraid. Jeremiah Clement stood slowly from his chair, walked to the counter, and began trimming the wick of the damaged lantern, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not look at any of the men. He did not speak. He simply tended to the lamp as if this were an ordinary occurrence, as if lanterns always shattered and flared in response to spoken words. His hands, though, were shaking. Elizabeth, watching from the doorway to the back room, saw this and felt a coldness settle into her bones that had nothing to do with the winter outside. That night, the miners did not drink. They did not tell stories. They sat in near silence, speaking only when necessary, and even then in voices so soft they could barely be heard over the crack and pop of the fire. The lanterns burned steady and calm. When the men finally rose to retire to the bunkhouse, they moved quickly, as if eager to escape the watchful presence of those flames. Jeremiah extinguished 3 of the 4 lanterns, leaving only the one on the counter burning. He and Elizabeth went to their room. Neither of them slept. In the days that followed, life at Clement Station took on a strange, oppressive quality. The miners did not leave. The weather, they said, was still too dangerous. The snow fell constantly now, heavy wet flakes that piled up against the buildings and made the world beyond the station invisible. They were trapped there, all of them, caught between the storm and the mountains, and in that isolation the lanterns became the center of all attention. The miners began to test them. At first they did it subtly, carefully. Someone would make a small false statement and watch to see if the lanterns responded. They did, always. The correlation was perfect, absolute, undeniable. A lie about age, a lie about hometown, a lie about anything at all, and the flames would surge. The truth, no matter how painful or embarrassing, left the lanterns untouched. It was as if the flames could see into the human heart, could measure intention and honesty with a precision that no human judge could ever achieve. Thomas Pike became obsessed with understanding the mechanism. He was the youngest of the miners, barely 25, and he had something of an education, having attended a seminary in Pennsylvania before wandering west in search of adventure. He theorized that it must be some natural phenomenon, some property of the air, or the altitude, or perhaps even the geology of the region that created a sensitivity in the flames. He spoke of phosphorus and magnetic fields and atmospheric electricity, using words that the other miners did not understand, but that sounded reassuringly scientific and therefore safe. But his theories could not explain everything. They could not explain why the lanterns only responded to spoken lies, not to lies written or thought or merely implied. They could not explain why the flames could distinguish between honest mistakes and deliberate deceptions. They could not explain why, when Thomas himself suggested that this was all just coincidence and nothing supernatural was occurring, the lantern nearest him blazed so brightly that everyone had to shield their eyes, and the young man himself fell silent, his face gone pale as old bone. Nathaniel Cord reacted differently. He grew angry. He declared the whole thing a trick, some con that Jeremiah Clement was running to cheat them, or scare them, or achieve some purpose that remained unclear. He demanded to inspect the lanterns, to take them apart, to prove that they were rigged. Jeremiah allowed this. He handed over one of the lanterns and watched as Cord dismantled it piece by piece on the wooden table. There was nothing inside but the normal components of any ordinary lamp. Tin reservoir, cotton wick, brass burner assembly, glass chimney. No wires, no hidden chambers, no mechanism of any kind. Just a simple lantern, identical to 10,000 others being used at that very moment across the frontier. Cord reassembled it. He filled it with fresh kerosene from a different barrel. He lit it with a match from his own pocket. The lantern burned normally, casting its yellow light across the table. Then Cord said, speaking slowly and clearly, that he had never cheated anyone in a business deal. The flame shot up like a geyser. Cord stumbled backward, his face a mask of rage and fear. He grabbed the lantern and hurled it against the wall. It shattered, kerosene splashing across the logs, flames spreading in a bright sheet before Jeremiah managed to smother it with a blanket. The smell of burning wool and spilled fuel filled the room. No one spoke. Cord stood breathing hard, his fists clenched, staring at the scorched wall as if it had personally insulted him. That night, Jeremiah and Elizabeth heard the miners arguing in the bunkhouse. The walls were thin and voices carried. They could not make out individual words, but the tone was clear. Accusation, denial, rising anger. The argument went on for hours, punctuated by the sound of furniture being moved, of objects being thrown. Then, abruptly, silence. Jeremiah rose from his bed and looked out through a gap in the oiled paper window. The bunkhouse was dark. Snow was falling again, thick and soft. Nothing moved. He returned to bed, but did not sleep. Morning came late and gray. The miners emerged from the bunkhouse one by one, not speaking to each other, not making eye contact. Their breakfast was eaten in silence. Afterward, they did not gather in the main room as had become their custom. Instead, they dispersed. Some went to the stable. Some remained in the bunkhouse. Thomas Pike sat alone in a corner of the main room, staring at one of the remaining lanterns with an expression that was equal parts fear and fascination. It was Elizabeth who first noticed that one of the miners was missing. She was counting heads as she served the midday meal, a habit born from years of keeping track of customers and guests, and she realized that only 6 men sat at the table. She mentioned this quietly to Jeremiah. He counted as well. 6. The missing man was Samuel Brent, the one who had spoken of his faithful wife. They found him in the stable, hanging from a beam. He had used his own belt. His face was purple, his tongue protruding, his eyes open and bulging. He had been dead for several hours. The cold had kept the body from swelling. There was no note. Jeremiah cut him down while Elizabeth turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth. They carried the body to the smokehouse, which was empty and cold enough to preserve him until the ground thawed enough for burial. That would not be for months. The miners gathered when they heard the news. They stood in a circle around Cord, who seemed to have assumed leadership by virtue of having the loudest voice and the most aggressive manner. He wanted to know what had happened. Jeremiah told him. Cord looked at each of his remaining companions in turn, his face hard. Then he said that they needed to leave, that this place was cursed, that the lanterns were from hell, and Samuel had killed himself because he could not live with whatever truths they had forced him to face. His words came out in a rush, desperate and frightened beneath the bluster. But Thomas Pike shook his head. He said they could not leave in this weather. To attempt travel now would be suicide. They had no choice but to wait for the storm to break, no matter what haunted this place. The others agreed, though their agreement was reluctant and silent. They returned to the bunkhouse. Jeremiah and Elizabeth stood alone in the snow, looking at the smokehouse where Samuel Brent's body lay frozen. That evening, no one lit the lanterns in the main room. The miners sat in darkness, illuminated only by the fireplace. They did not speak. They did not make noise. They sat like men in a church, or perhaps like men in a prison cell, waiting for something they could not name. Jeremiah sat with them and Elizabeth as well, all of them together in the flickering red light of the flames. It was Nathaniel Cord who finally broke the silence. He stood up, his large frame casting a shadow that stretched across the ceiling. He said that they needed to talk, that they needed to clear the air, that Samuel's death was a tragedy but that they were still alive, and that they needed to trust each other if they were going to survive this winter. He said this in a voice that was meant to sound strong and reassuring, but that came out hollow and false. As he spoke, one of the unlit lanterns on the wall began to glow. There was no flame. No one had lit it. The wick was not even trimmed, but a cold blue light emanated from within the glass, growing brighter and brighter until it filled the room with a luminescence that was nothing like the warm yellow of burning kerosene. It was the light of deep ice, of frozen lakes, of the aurora that danced in the northern sky on the coldest nights of winter. It was beautiful and terrible and absolutely impossible. Everyone in the room saw it. There was no denying it now, no rationalizing it away, no pretending that this was some natural phenomenon or some trick or some coincidence. The lantern burned without fire, without fuel, without any possible earthly explanation, and it burned in direct response to Nathaniel Cord's false words about trust and survival. Cord stared at the lantern. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. He tried to speak again, tried to say that this was not happening, that it could not be real. But before the words could form, the blue light flared so intensely that it seemed to penetrate flesh itself, showing the shadows of bones beneath skin, the dark outlines of organs within bodies. For a moment, everyone in that room was rendered transparent, revealed as nothing more than temporary arrangements of meat and bone held together by will and ignorance. Then the light vanished, and the lantern was dark again, just an empty vessel hanging from a hook. Thomas Pike was weeping. He made no sound, but tears ran freely down his face. He said in a whisper that they were being judged, that something in this place was holding them accountable for their lies, their deceptions, their false lives. He said that Samuel must have had some terrible secret, some lie so fundamental to his existence that he could not face its exposure, and so he had chosen death instead. Another miner, a man named Jack Horvath, who had been silent throughout all of this, suddenly stood and walked to where one of the cold lanterns hung. He reached up and touched the glass. It was so cold that his skin froze to it instantly. He had to tear his hand away, leaving a patch of skin behind. Blood welled up from his palm. He stared at his own blood, dark in the firelight, and then he began to laugh. It was not a sane sound. It went on until Nathaniel Cord slapped him hard across the face, and then it stopped, replaced by ragged breathing and the sound of the wind outside. That was the night the accusations began. One man said that another had stolen from him back in Fort Benton. The accused denied it. A lantern lit itself with that cold blue flame, floating in the darkness like a drowned moon, and the denial was revealed as a lie. The thief admitted it. Then someone else accused someone else of having murdered a man in a claim dispute 3 years prior. Another denial, another cold light, another truth forced into the open like pus squeezed from a wound. The confessions came faster and faster, each man suddenly desperate to purge himself of his lies before the lanterns could expose them. They spoke of cheating and theft, of claim jumping and fraud, of wives left behind without word, of debts unpaid, of partnerships betrayed. They spoke of violence too, of men beaten and abandoned, of a native woman raped and left for dead, of a partner pushed from a cliff when the gold he carried became more appealing than his companionship. They spoke of every sin and shame that weighed upon them, and with each confession the lanterns burned cold and blue and absolutely without mercy. Jeremiah Clement sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. This was beyond anything he had imagined. The lanterns were not simply revealing lies. They were extracting confessions, forcing these men to speak truths that they had buried so deep that perhaps they had forgotten them themselves. He looked at Elizabeth and saw his own horror reflected in her face. They were witnessing something that should not be possible, something that violated every natural law, and there was nothing they could do but watch and listen. The confessions went on for hours. By the time the last man had spoken, by the time every sin had been dragged into the light, dawn was approaching. The miners sat slumped in their chairs, exhausted, hollowed out, their faces gray and empty. The lanterns had finally gone dark. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was bitterly cold. Thomas Pike was the first to move. He stood slowly like an old man, though he was still young. He said, in a voice that was almost too soft to hear, that they had to destroy the lanterns, that as long as they existed no one here would be safe, that they would burn away everything, every secret, every comfortable lie that made life bearable, until there was nothing left but raw, screaming truth. Nathaniel Cord nodded. For once, he had nothing to say. The other miners rose and began taking down the lanterns. They carried them outside into the snow. They placed them in a line on the frozen ground. Then Cord produced a pistol from his coat and began shooting them, one by one. The glass exploded in glittering showers. The tin bodies crumpled under the impact of the bullets. Within minutes, all 4 lanterns were destroyed, reduced to twisted metal and scattered glass. But destroying the lanterns changed nothing. That night, when new lamps were brought out to light the main room, they behaved exactly as the old ones had. When anyone spoke a lie, even the smallest and most innocent of falsehoods, they flared and burned with either yellow fire or cold blue light depending on the severity of the deception. It did not matter that these were different lanterns, purchased from different merchants, carried in from different rooms. The curse, if that was what it was, did not reside in the objects themselves. It resided in the place, in Clement Station. In this particular piece of ground, on the western bank of the Yellowstone River. Over the following days, the miners began to deteriorate. They stopped eating. They stopped sleeping. They huddled in the bunkhouse, speaking only when absolutely necessary, and even then in whispers that they prayed would not trigger the lantern's response. But silence could not protect them. Sometimes, the lanterns would light themselves when no one had spoken at all, responding to thoughts, to intentions, to the lies that people told themselves inside their own heads. The deterioration was not merely physical, though that was certainly evident. Their bodies grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and uncertain. But the true decay was happening in some deeper place, in the architecture of self that every human being constructs to make existence bearable. Each man had built an identity over the years, a story about who he was and what he had done and why he had done it. These stories were composites of truth and falsehood, memory and invention, carefully edited versions of reality that allowed them to sleep at night and face themselves in mirrors. The lanterns dismantled these constructions piece by piece, burning away every comfortable fiction until what remained was something raw and unfinished, something that had never been meant to be exposed to light. Nathaniel Cord, who had always thought of himself as a natural leader, discovered that his authority had been built on nothing more substantial than volume and aggression. Without the ability to bluff or deceive or shade the truth to his advantage, he found he had no real influence at all. The other men stopped listening to him. His pronouncements, which had once carried weight, now fell into silence, ignored and irrelevant. He tried to reassert himself through force, but even that failed. When he grabbed Thomas Pike by the collar and threatened him, the lanterns blazed so brightly that everyone in the room could see the truth written across Cord's face. He was afraid, terribly, desperately afraid. And once that fear was visible, once it could no longer be hidden behind bluster and aggression, he became small, diminished, just another frightened man waiting to die. Thomas Pike's deterioration took a different form. He had always prided himself on his intelligence, on his education, on his ability to reason through problems and find rational explanations for mysterious events. The lanterns made a mockery of that pride. Every theory he proposed was immediately revealed as inadequate, every explanation exposed as wishful thinking dressed up in scientific language. He began to realize that his intelligence was not the objective tool he had imagined, but rather another form of deception, a way of imposing comfortable patterns on chaos that stubbornly refused to conform to any pattern at all. This realization broke something in him. He became obsessed with the idea that perhaps truth itself was impossible, that the lanterns were not revealing reality, but simply creating another kind of lie, a more insidious lie that masqueraded as revelation. He spoke about this at length one evening, his voice rising higher and higher as he tried to convince himself and everyone else that what they were experiencing could not be trusted. The lanterns burned so fiercely in response that the walls themselves seemed to catch fire, though no wood was consumed. Thomas stopped talking. He never spoke again. Jack Horvath, whose hand had frozen to the lantern glass, watched his wound fester. The cold had damaged the tissue in ways that would not heal. The flesh around the burn turned black, then green, then began to emit an odor that was unmistakable. Gangrene. He needed a doctor, or at least someone who knew how to amputate properly before the infection spread. But there was no one. Jeremiah Clement had never performed surgery. The other miners had no medical knowledge beyond the basic frontier medicine of whiskey and prayer. So Horvath's hand rotted while he was still alive, the poison slowly creeping up his arm toward his heart. He could have tried to cut it off himself. He had a knife. He had seen men survive such operations, had even assisted with one years earlier in a mining camp in Nevada. But to do so would require lying to himself about the chances of survival, about the likelihood of infection, about the probability that he would simply bleed out on the floor of the bunkhouse while the lanterns watched. And he found he could no longer maintain those lies. The lanterns had taken from him the capacity for self-deception, and without that capacity, he could not generate the false hope necessary to take such desperate action. So he sat and watched his hand rot and waited for the infection to kill him, which it eventually did. William Teague was the quietest of them all. He had always been quiet, even before the lanterns began their terrible work. He was a man who had spent most of his life alone, trapping in the mountains, prospecting in empty valleys, avoiding human contact whenever possible. He had come west to escape something, though he never said what. Now, trapped at Clement Station with nowhere to run, and no way to avoid the scrutiny of those cold blue flames, whatever he was running from had finally caught up with him. He did not speak of it. He did not confess. He simply withdrew deeper and deeper into himself until he became almost invisible, a shadow sitting in the corner, barely breathing, barely existing. The lanterns ignored him for the most part, as if he had already burned away so much of himself that there was nothing left worth exposing. When he finally disappeared one night, walking out into the snow without a word, no one was surprised. It seemed inevitable. He was not fleeing the station. He was fleeing existence itself, seeking the only escape that the lanterns could not prevent. The others died in their own ways, at their own speeds, but the pattern was always the same. The lanterns would reveal some fundamental lie that they had built their lives upon, some fiction about who they were or what they had done or why they mattered. Once that lie was exposed, once it could no longer be maintained, the structure of self collapsed. And without that structure, without the stories they told themselves about themselves, they found they could not continue. It was not that they chose death exactly. It was more that they stopped choosing life. The difference is subtle but important. They did not actively seek to end their existence. They simply ceased to maintain it. They forgot to eat, or forgot to stay warm, or forgot to care whether they woke up the next morning. And so, one by one, they stopped waking up. Jeremiah Clement observed all of this with a kind of detached horror. He was witnessing the systematic destruction of human personality, the reduction of complex individuals to bare biological processes that eventually failed for lack of any reason to continue. It was educational in a terrible way. It taught him things about the human condition that he had never wanted to know. It revealed to him the degree to which identity itself was a lie, a constructed narrative that required constant maintenance and could not survive prolonged exposure to truth. He began to understand that perhaps there was no such thing as a true self, beneath all the layers of fiction and performance. Perhaps the fictions were all there was, and when they burned away, nothing remained but meat and bone, and the animal processes that kept meat alive. This realization should have driven him to the same fate as the miners. By all logic, by all precedent, he should have walked into the snow or fashioned a noose, or simply stopped eating until his body gave out. But something in him resisted. It was not courage. It was not hope. It was certainly not any belief that his life had meaning or purpose or value. It was something more fundamental and less noble. It was simple stubbornness, the same quality that keeps an injured animal alive long past the point where death would be a mercy. His body refused to quit. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept drawing air. And so he continued, not because he wanted to, but because some deep part of him that existed below consciousness and below will simply would not stop. Jack Horvath was the second to die. He walked out into a blizzard without coat or boots and was found the next morning, frozen solid, sitting upright against a tree with his eyes open. Thomas Pike tried to leave despite the weather and made it less than a mile before the cold took him. His body was not found until spring. 2 more miners followed in the subsequent week, one to frostbite that turned to gangrene, another to what seemed to be simple despair. He simply stopped moving, stopped responding, and after 3 days of that stillness, his heart gave out. Only Nathaniel Cord and one other man, whose name was William Teague, remained by the end of November. They existed in a state of near catatonia, barely speaking, barely moving. The lanterns burned constantly now, day and night, without fuel, without flame. Just cold blue light that filled every corner of Clement Station and spilled out through the windows into the snow. Elizabeth Clement became ill. She developed a fever and a cough that would not stop. Jeremiah tended to her as best he could, but he was helpless. There was no doctor for 200 miles. The medicine chest contained only whiskey and laudanum. She weakened rapidly. One night, as Jeremiah sat beside her bed holding her hand, she asked him if he had always been faithful to her. It was not an accusation. It was just a question, asked in a small, tired voice. Jeremiah hesitated. In his youth, before they were married, there had been a woman in St. Louis. It had meant nothing. It had been forgotten, but it had happened. He thought about lying. He thought about giving Elizabeth the comfort of believing that he had been hers and hers alone since the first day they met. But even as the impulse formed, He saw the lantern on the bedside table begin to glow with that cold blue light, waiting, watching, ready to expose him if he chose deception. So he told her the truth. He told her about the woman in St. Louis. He watched Elizabeth's face as he spoke, watched something in her eyes flicker and dim. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she squeezed his hand and said that she forgave him. The lantern returned to darkness. She died 3 days later. Jeremiah buried her in the smokehouse next to the frozen bodies of the miners who had killed themselves. He could not dig a grave. The ground was frozen solid. So he laid her out as best he could, wrapped in a blanket, her hands folded across her chest. He stood over her for a long time, trying to pray, but no prayers would come. The lanterns had burned away his capacity for any speech that was not absolutely, painfully true. And the truth was that he did not know if there was a God or if Elizabeth's soul had gone anywhere at all, or if death was simply the end of everything. When he returned to the main building, he found that Nathaniel Court had hanged himself from the same beam where Samuel Brent had died. William Teague was gone, though whether he had fled into the wilderness or simply wandered away in a daze, Jeremiah never knew. He was alone at Clement Station with the bodies of the dead and the lanterns that would not stop burning. The winter deepened. The snow piled higher. Jeremiah existed in a state that was not quite life and not quite death. He ate when he remembered to eat. He kept the fire burning. He did not speak, not even to himself. The lanterns filled every room with their cold blue light, and in that light every surface, every object, every corner of the station seemed to be revealed for what it truly was. The wood was rotting. The sod roof was collapsing. The foundations were cracked. Everything that had seemed solid and permanent was shown to be temporary, failing, dying. Jeremiah began to understand what the lanterns truly were. They were not judging lies in any moral sense. They were simply revealing the truth that everything humans build, everything they say, everything they believe about themselves and the world, is fundamentally false. The structures they create will fall. The words they speak will be forgotten. The meanings they assign to their lives will dissolve like smoke. The lanterns were showing him that truth itself was the ultimate horror, that to see reality without the comfortable lies that humans use to cushion themselves against it was to see something so terrible that most people would choose death rather than face it. He thought about joining them. He had rope. He had a beam. It would be simple, but something in him resisted. Not hope, certainly. Not the belief that things would improve. Just a stubborn, animal refusal to surrender. The same quality that kept his heart beating and his lungs drawing breath, even when consciousness seemed like an unbearable burden. Spring came eventually. It always does. The snow melted. The river thawed. The frozen bodies in the smokehouse began to rot, filling the air with a sweetish, putrid smell. Jeremiah dragged them out one by one and burned them in a pyre that sent black smoke rising into the clear blue sky. He burned Elizabeth last. He tried to say something, some words of goodbye, but the lanterns were watching, and any false sentiment, any comforting lie, would be immediately exposed. So he remained silent and watched her body burn. Traders arrived in April. They were the first human contact Jeremiah had experienced in 6 months. They found him sitting outside the main building, staring at the river, thin as a skeleton. He told them nothing about what had happened. When they asked about his wife, he said she had died of fever. When they asked about the miners who had been staying there, he said they had left. The lanterns inside the building burned cold and blue in response to his lies. But the traders did not enter, did not see, did not know. They offered to take him with them back to Fort Benton. He refused. They asked why. He could not explain. How could he tell them that he could not leave, that something in this place held him, that the lanterns would not release him until he had been burned down to nothing but truth, and that he did not know how much truth a human being could hold before they simply ceased to exist? The traders left. Jeremiah remained. He still remains in a sense, though whether the man who sits at Clement Station now is truly Jeremiah, or simply something wearing his shape, is a question with no clear answer. Travelers who pass through report seeing lights in the windows at night, cold blue lights that flicker and pulse like heartbeats. They report that if they go inside and speak in that place, the lanterns will respond to their words, burning bright with every lie, remaining dark with every truth. Most travelers do not enter. They camp outside and leave at first light. There are stories told along the Yellowstone about what happened at Clement Station in the winter of 1860. Most of them are wrong. They speak of ghosts and demons, of Indian curses and vengeful spirits. These are comfortable lies, the kind of stories people tell to make the strange and terrible fit into patterns they can understand. But the truth is simpler and more horrible. The truth is that there are places where lies cannot exist, where the distance between what is spoken and what is real collapses to nothing, where everything false is burned away until only naked, unspeakable truth remains. Clement Station is such a place. The lanterns are still there, they still burn. They are waiting. Why this happened, no one knows. There are theories, of course. Some say the station was built on ground sacred to the native peoples, and that the lanterns are a punishment for that violation. Others say that the earth itself in that location is somehow different, that geological formations create conditions that make thoughts and words visible. Still others believe that it was the accumulation of lies told at that trading post over the years, the endless small deceits of commerce and survival that finally reached some critical mass and created a feedback loop, a place where falsehood could no longer maintain its structure. But theories are just another form of lie, another way of imposing comfortable patterns on chaos. The truth is that no one knows why the lanterns at Clement Station burn in response to lies. They simply do. They have continued to do so for 165 years. The station is abandoned now, the buildings collapsing, the trading post long since rendered obsolete by railroads and highways. But the lanterns remain, burning in the ruins, cold blue light spilling out through gaps in the walls on moonless nights. There are people who seek such places out, who travel to Clement Station deliberately to test themselves against the lanterns. They go inside with questions they want answered, truths they want to speak, lies they want to purge from their lives. Most do not stay long. A few minutes in that cold blue light is enough to strip away years of self-deception, to reveal the comfortable fictions that make daily existence bearable. To remain longer is to risk what happened to the miners in 1860, to be burned away layer by layer until nothing remains but raw, screaming truth that the human mind cannot process without breaking. And yet, people still go. Even knowing the danger, even understanding what waits there, they make the pilgrimage to that ruined station on the Yellowstone River. Perhaps it is because we are all liars, every one of us. We lie to others and to ourselves, constructing elaborate narratives that give our lives meaning and purpose and significance. We lie about who we are and who we have been and who we want to become. These lies are not malicious, most of them. They are simply necessary. They are the stories we tell to make existence bearable, to bridge the gap between what we are and what we wish we were. But there is a price to be paid for living in falsehood, even comfortable and necessary falsehood. The price is a kind of spiritual rot, a distance from reality that grows wider with every untrue word until we become strangers to ourselves, actors playing roles that we no longer remember writing. The lanterns at Clement Station offer a terrible cure for this condition. They offer truth, absolute and uncompromising, regardless of whether that truth can be endured. They offer the opportunity to stand in the light and be known, completely and without mercy. Most people cannot pay this price. Most people should not try. The lanterns do not discriminate. They do not care about intentions or justifications or mitigating circumstances. They simply respond to the difference between what is said and what is real, and that difference is often greater than people imagine. To stand in their light is to confront every self-serving rationalization, every convenient omission, every polite fiction that makes society possible. It is to see yourself as you truly are, stripped of all the narratives and performances that constitute personality. And what remains after that stripping is often so small, so sad, so unimpressive, that it cannot support the weight of continued existence. This is what happened to the miners in 1860. This is what happened to Elizabeth Clement, who forgave her husband's infidelity, but could not forgive the larger lie of believing that any love or any loyalty was truly permanent and unconditional. This is what happened to Jeremiah Clement himself, who remained at the station not out of choice but because the lanterns had revealed to him the fundamental meaninglessness of all human endeavor, and once that knowledge was gained, there was nowhere else to go. All places were equally empty. All actions were equally futile. Better to sit beside the river and watch it flow, the water at least being honest in its purposeless motion toward the sea. The Yellowstone River still flows past the ruins of Clement Station. It flows exactly as it did in 1860, cold and black and swift between walls of stone. The river does not lie. It does not deceive. It simply is, carrying snowmelt and silt and the occasional drowned thing downstream to wherever rivers go. If you stand on the bank and listen, you can hear it speaking in its wordless language, saying the same thing it has always said, which is nothing and everything simultaneously. The Montana Territory is a state now, has been for more than a century. The frontier is closed, the wilderness mapped, the empty spaces filled with towns and roads and satellites that make getting lost nearly impossible. But there are still places like Clement Station, places where the membrane between word and truth grows thin, where lies cannot maintain their structure, where reality bleeds through the comfortable fictions we use to contain it. These places are dangerous. They are necessary. They remind us that beneath all our constructions and narratives and meanings, there is something else, something that does not care about our stories, something that simply is. Whether that something is God or geology, spirit or simple physics, consciousness or chemical reaction, no one can say. The lanterns do not provide explanations. They do not offer comfort or understanding or anything that could be mistaken for meaning. They only show what is real, and reality, it turns out, is not something most human minds are equipped to perceive without mediation, without the cushioning layers of interpretation and belief that allow us to function from day to day. This is the lesson of Clement Station. This is the truth that the lanterns teach. We are all liars, and we must be, because the alternative is to face a reality so vast and indifferent and devoid of the meanings we project onto it that consciousness itself becomes unbearable. The miners who died there in 1860 were not being punished for their sins. They were simply being shown what they were without the protective lies they had built around themselves, and that showing was more than they could survive. So the lanterns burn. They have burned for 165 years, and they will continue to burn for as long as there are humans to lie and truths to be revealed. They are not malevolent. They are not even conscious, in any sense that we would recognize. They are simply a phenomenon, like gravity or time, indifferent to the damage they cause in the same way that a cliff is indifferent to the person who falls from it. They show what is real. That is their only function. That is their only purpose. And that is enough to make them the most dangerous thing in the Montana Territory, more dangerous than winter or wilderness or any predator that hunts on four legs. If you ever find yourself on the Yellowstone River, near where the old trading routes used to run, and you see lights burning in the ruins of abandoned buildings, cold blue lights that pulse and flicker in the darkness, do not approach. Do not enter. Do not test yourself against the lanterns thinking that you are honest enough, true enough, clean enough to withstand what they will show you. You are not. None of us are. We are all built on lies, gentle lies and harsh lies, necessary lies and convenient lies, lies we tell others and lies we tell ourselves. These lies are the foundation of personality, of society, of everything we call human. To have them burned away is to be left with nothing, less than nothing, a howling absence where a person used to be. The lanterns do not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. They do not care about your intentions or your justifications or your deeply held beliefs. They only care about the difference between what you say and what is true. And that difference is always greater than you imagine. Always. Without exception. The most honest person you know is still a liar, still constructing narratives, still editing reality to make it bearable. This is not a moral failing. It is a survival mechanism, as necessary to human consciousness as breathing is to human flesh. To abandon it voluntarily is to choose a kind of death, a dissolution of self that may leave the body alive, but renders it nothing more than meat that moves and breathes without purpose or direction. So avoid Clement Station. Avoid places like it. Avoid any location where truth becomes physical, where lies have weight and fire, where the comfortable distance between the stories we tell and the reality we inhabit collapses to nothing. Such places are not meant for us. They are tears in the fabric of the world as we have made it, glimpses of something that exists before and beneath and beyond all human meaning. To look too long into that abyss is to invite it to look back, and what looks back is not a monster or a demon or anything that can be fought or understood or appeased. It is simply truth, naked and absolute, and it will burn away everything you think you are until nothing remains but ash, and the cold blue light of lanterns that lit themselves whenever someone lied. This is how the story ends. This is how it must end. With a warning and a truth. The warning is clear. Stay away from Clement Station. Stay away from any place where lies cannot exist. The truth is harder. The truth is that we need those lies. Need them the way we need air and water, and the comforting darkness that hides us from the stars. Without them, we are nothing. And if you do not believe this, if you think yourself capable of living in absolute truth, then I invite you to travel to the Yellowstone River, to find the ruins of that old trading post, to step inside and speak your truth to the lanterns that wait there. They will show you what you are. They will show you what everything is. And when they do, you will understand why the miners chose to die, why Elizabeth gave up her ghost, why Jeremiah sits by the river even now, waiting for an end that may never come. The lanterns are burning. They are always burning. They light themselves whenever someone lies. And since we are always lying, always constructing comfortable fictions, always editing reality to make it bearable, they never go dark. They burn in the ruins of Clement Station. They burn in other places too, places scattered across the world where the membrane between word and truth has worn thin. They burn in the human heart, if you know how to look, a cold blue fire that reveals everything and forgives nothing. They are waiting for you. They have always been waiting. And when you finally stand before them, when you finally speak your truth or your lie into their cold blue light, you will learn what the miners learned, what Jeremiah learned, what everyone who has ever sought the truth has eventually learned. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned, some revelations cannot be survived, and some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. The story of Clement Station is over. The story of the lanterns is not. It continues night after night, winter after winter, burning cold and blue in the ruins of human ambition. If you listen carefully on quiet nights, when the wind blows from the north and carries with it the smell of snow and stone and deep time, you can hear them. Not the lanterns themselves, but the effect they have on the world around them. A silence, a stillness, the absence of all the comfortable lies that fill the air in other places. It is the most terrifying sound you will ever hear. It is the sound of truth. And truth, as it turns out, sounds like nothing at all. Just the wind, just the river, just the emptiness that was always there, beneath all our words, waiting to be revealed.